Hello, I'm Chris Browder. This is video 4.2 in my series on second language acquisition theory and research. In this video, I'm going to talk about motivation and second language acquisition. This video is very largely based on one part of Chapter 3 of Rod Ellis's text, Understanding Second Language Acquisition. Unlike most of my videos, I don't depart much from his summary this time because his summary is so spot on. I'm going to start with a summary of some main points. The first main point is this term conative. Motivation is referred to as a conative factor that influences second language acquisition, and conative is best understood in contrast to cognitive. Cognitive factors involve setting goals and making effort to achieve them. In contrast, cognitive factors, as you already know, involve cognition, which is essentially thinking, processing, attention, and other learning related actions taking place in the mind. Obviously, second language learning requires both. In previous videos, we discussed how age is such an important factor in SLA, but acknowledged that some adults can overcome their supposed disadvantages and acquire second languages successfully. In order to overcome these disadvantages and make the most of their advantages, however, adults have to be very motivated. In other words, for adults, motivation very much determines success. But what exactly is motivation? Right now, SLA researchers pretty much understand that motivation is not a character trait. It's not something that you either have or you don't have. Instead, we're coming to view motivation as a process. This process involves many factors that are all interacting and feeding back on one another in upward spirals and downward spirals. This process involves many factors, and this process is very dynamic. In other words, a person's motivation is not static or internal. It's the result of many external factors acting on the learner and changing or transforming the learner's motivation level. It begins when a learner has a reason for wanting to learn. Then it is impacted by the learning context, such as teachers or opportunities to use the language in a way that provides some dignity and reward instead of punishment. Finally, it is impacted by how the learner views this whole learning experience and how she evaluates herself, reevaluates the goal, takes a good look at her context. Ultimately, it's all about hope. The earliest research on motivation in SLA begins by borrowing ideas from sociopsychology. In 1972, Gardner and Lambert gave us this notion that motivation could be integrative or instrumental. With integrative motivation, the learner is interested in the people who use the target language and wants to be able to interact with those people or further appreciate their culture. An example of this that I'm seeing a lot of recently is young people who want to learn the Korean language because they like K-pop. So, in other words, they're not getting a better SAT score. This is not learning Korean is not going to get them a better job. It's not going to get them a better car, better money. It's just that they like these videos, K-pop videos, or they like Korean dramas. They like the way it sounds. They like the way that people look. It's just attractive to them and it makes them feel good. So they want to understand the lyrics. They want to understand the language. They want to be a part of it. It's exciting to them. Now, this integrative motivation can be distinguished from instrumental motivation, which is a situation where a person is learning a language in order to gain something other than just enjoying access to the people and their culture. Examples of instrumental motivation would include learning a second language to get better grades, pass a test, or employment, some kind of financial gain, something external, right? Um, Examples of instrumental motivation. So, yeah, by the way, notice this term instrumental. So, you're learning a language because it's an instrument that, like a tool that allows you to get something or do something, right? Um, a lot of research has been done on these two types of motivation. Most show that both can be successful as long as the learner has some self regulation. As you can guess, grades may not be motivating to someone who doesn't care about grades. But if someone really cares about grades enough, they will do whatever they have to do, including memorizing memorizing large numbers of vocabulary words. The next theory I will introduce comes from Robert Gardner, like the last one. Just to clarify something, this is not Howard Gardner. This is not Howard Gardner who gave us the theory of multiple intelligences. This next theory is Gardner's sociocultural model. This model for explaining motivation proposes that the learner's beliefs and attitudes play a very important role in the learning outcomes. So, for instance, if a learner believes that he cannot successfully learn a second language, then he is less likely to invest the time and effort to make it work. Similarly, if the learner does not believe the teacher or the method, then the teacher or method will be less successful for that learner. I'd like to connect this to Catherine Wenzel and her work with what's called pedagogical caring. Wenzel found that students' relationships with their teachers were very influential on their attitudes, beliefs, and, thereby influencing their motivation. Not just short term, but long term. We're talking about life trajectories here. In other words, if a student really likes her Spanish teacher, then the student will internalize her values. So, in other words, a good Spanish teacher might make you decide that you want to learn Spanish. And this effect will continue long after the class is done. In other words, a good teacher who has caring teaching relationships with her students can instill in them lasting interest in the subject she is teaching. So, just to clarify, what she's calling pedagogical caring, it's not like a touchy-feely kind of caring, like where the teacher's like, "Oh, I love you so much. I really care about you." Pedagogical caring is really actually teaching practices and a style of communicating with the teachers that convinces that the students that the teacher really actually does care about them, not that she pretends to care about them, but that she values them, she believes in them, and believes in their learning and is willing to put some work into it. Good lesson planning, good feedback, and grading of assignments is another way to do it, but just also mutually respectful communication and respecting their intelligence and believing that they can be interested in it and not blaming them for their lack of motivation. Um, so another big connection I'd like to suggest to Gardner's social cultural theory of SLA is a connection to Schumann's acculturation model. As you might recall from earlier videos, Schumann argued that language learners' attitudes and beliefs about the target language and the people who use it affect their learning outcomes. So, for example, if you move to a country but you don't really like the people there, then you might make less effort to learn their language because you just don't like them and you don't want to talk to them. You don't want to be friends with them. Interestingly, however, there's some complicated evidence somewhat to the contrary. Some researchers have found that immigrants sometimes work harder to learn a language specifically because of the mistreatment that they're experiencing. In other words, mistreatment can motivate a language learner to prove people wrong or even beat them at their own game. Like the ultimate revenge for an immigrant who's mistreated in a country is to do better than the people who are mistreating her. When you raise your kids and your kids go off to Harvard and they become the boss, that's a kind of revenge, and that is a kind of motivation. Um, Later views on L2 motivation are taken from cognitive psychology. One of those theories is self-determination theory, and this theory gives us the notion of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. The assumption is that intrinsic motivation is superior to extrinsic motivation. And there's some research supporting that, but research also shows that both can be positively correlated with success. So, intrinsic motivation is when someone finds the learning itself to be motivating and it doesn't expect to get anything in return. So, this might obviously overlap with integrative motivation, as you can expect, right? But it goes beyond that. So, for example, maybe there's a language and you don't really like the people, you don't really want to spend time with the people, but you just find the language really, really, really fascinating and interesting or fun. So you want to learn it because learning the language is somehow rewarding for you. Extrinsic motivation, in contrast, is when the learners are motivated because they expect to gain something such as higher grades or a better job or whatever. Um, the good thing about the intrinsic motivation is that it does seem to require, well, both intrinsic and extrinsic motivation require self-regulation, right? You have to be able to discipline yourself and control yourself and engage your mind in this learning so you can succeed. I would argue with integrative motivation, you're more likely to succeed because you actually enjoy doing it. You're getting something from it. You're getting pleasure from it instead of pain. Um, and I might also want to connect this to the idea of self-esteem. If something's rewarding, you're having good experiences, you're experiencing success, you might keep on doing it because it makes you feel good. It makes you feel smart, in other words. If something makes you feel smart, you might do it for that reason alone. Likewise, if something makes you feel stupid, you might avoid it for that reason alone. All right, attribution theory. Attribution theory is also taken from cognitive psychology, and it also focuses on how a learner's beliefs are influencing his motivation. I find this similar to the idea of locus of control. The question for the learner is, who controls your learning outcome? Are you in control or is it out of your control? And internal attribution means the learner credits or blames herself for the success or failure. This can be good or bad depending largely on whether the learner has a growth mindset or a fixed mindset. With a fixed mindset, the learner might attribute the outcomes of her to her natural ability or lack of natural ability with statements like, I'm just not good at learning language, or I can't learn this because I'm stupid. That's a problem because if they believe that they're not capable of learning it because they're not intelligent enough, then they're not going to make much effort and they are going to fail. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? And the fixed mindset can be good if the learner believes that she's intelligent and believes that she's going to succeed. Then, yeah, she's going to approach it with more confidence and she's probably going to succeed for that reason. But I think it would be better if the learner had a growth mindset. The growth mindset, in contrast to the fixed mindset, means that the learner realizes her outcomes are the result of her effort and believes that she can get better at something if she tries hard enough. Um, Now let's contrast these internal attributions with external attributions. In attribution theory, external attributions mean that the learner might accredit the outcomes to external factors instead of her own effort. She might blame the teacher, the method, or some other aspect of her learning situation for her failure. Nevertheless, the bottom line is here, to keep it simple, with both attributions, learners won't try if they believe it is hopeless and pointless. They must believe success is possible, otherwise, they won't make effort. Now, if you're a teacher, and I believe many of you are at this point, right, or aspiring teachers, you really should be thinking about what you're doing with students and how you're teaching, what kind of experiences you're creating that could be influencing these different types of motivation. So, as I stated in the introduction, the most modern views of motivation don't fully locate it in the learner. Instead, they view the learner and her motivation as part of a dynamic process. Forces act upon the learners and influence them in ways that lead them to success or failure. The most influential person for this process, for process models of motivation in SLA would be a person named Zoltan Dornier. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that name correctly. All right, and the first of these modern models would be Dornier's process model of L2 motivation. This model identifies a process with 3 stages. The first stage is pre-action. In the stage, the learner is inspired somehow to make an effort and begins to set goals or have a vision for herself. In the second stage, the learner takes action. She tries to learn the second language. After that comes post-action. In this stage, the learner takes a look at her situation, her goals, her outcomes. If she views her situation as positive, hopeful, productive, then she might make more effort. If not, then she might change her approach or might even change her goals. She could just give up entirely, right? The process model has grown to include many factors that influence the L2 learning process, and one of those factors is group dynamics. In other words, the groups you belong to may strongly influence your motivation because they influence your beliefs, your attitudes, your behaviors, the entire process. Membership to a group involves conformity, peer pressure, influences, norms, values, rituals, beliefs, and of course, access, connections. Another very important part of this process, and I've been mentioning this throughout, it's something called self-regulation. Dornier has pointed out in his lectures that even motivated learners can fail to succeed if they cannot regulate themselves in order to actually cognitively engage in learning. Because learning, according to cognitivism, involves processing, attention. If a learner is motivated but doesn't self-regulate, then they're going to get online, getting ready to do the work, get distracted, decide to check some email, maybe check Facebook. 2 or 3 hours later, they haven't done it. A person who has self-regulation is going to realize the mistake they're making and redirect themselves, redirect their attention, exercise self-control. Dornier and others have suggested that at a high level of motivation, the person is more likely to engage in this self-reflection, self-evaluation, and as a result, will eventually get more self-regulation, which leads to more engagement and more learning. So basically, highly motivated learners set goals and take autonomous actions for learning instead of depending on teachers and other such people to make their learning happen. This difference is absolutely essential because ultimately the learning doesn't take place in the classroom, it takes place in the learner's mind. Last but not least is issues of identity. And, this is probably A good way to a good segue to discuss self-esteem and ego theory and other stuff, but let's not. That's a whole rabbit hole there. Um, Basically, a big name for this, well, big names, I guess, would be Uma Ushioda and Bonnie Norton. Um, they point out that communication in a second language can be motivating or demotivating based on its effect on the learner's identity. Language learning and language use situations allow learners to create a new identity they enjoy. In other words, when I speak German, I'm a German version of myself. And when I speak Korean, I'm a Korean version of myself. But this new identity can be a threat to the old identity, or it might be a nice escape. So consider that becoming a respected adult is largely about learning how to say the right thing the right way at the right time, right? That's really the difference between the adult and the child, right? Learning a new language means losing that ability and having to relearn it in a new context where the rules, the game is totally different. L2 identities, for this reason, can be empowering or disempowering, and they're definitely going to be disempowering at first. For some learners, the target language, however, might free them to do something they really want to do but aren't able to do in their own language. And these experiences determine whether the learner wants to invest the time and effort it takes to learn the language, or not just invest the time and effort, invest the risk, the humiliation. It's got to be worth their while. Norton uses case studies to illustrate this. So, for example, in her case studies, she shows that if a woman, for instance, comes from a culture where women are not allowed to disagree with men and are not allowed, especially not allowed to disagree with someone older than them, and then they're put into an English class, and not only are they allowed to state their opinions and disagree with other people, but they're encouraged to do so, they might find this very liberating. Uh, Likewise, if they're a mother and they feel that they've been mistreated or disrespected by the school, they might be motivated to learn English so they can defend themselves, defend their children, advocate for their children, support their family. This brings us to Dornier's L2 motivational self-system theory. Dornier proposed that language acquisition often involves the learner imagining a version of himself using the target language proficiently. And Dornier refers to this as the ideal L2 self. So think about this. Can you imagine a version of yourself using the target language? Do you like what you see? Do you like that version of yourself? Next comes what Darnier calls the ought-to self. The ought-to self involves the attributes that the learners believe they must possess in order to achieve the L2 self, the ideal L2 self. Does it seem possible or realistic for them to make that transformation? Do they believe that they're smart enough? Do they believe that they have the kind of access and resources to reach that goal? Finally, of course, comes the L2 learning experience. How does that learning experience influence the first two variables, change their beliefs, opinions? Does the learning experience itself convince them that they don't even want to become a fluent speaker of the target language, or does it convince them that their ideal L2 self is a realistic goal or an unrealistic goal? Does it convince them that it's hopeful or hopeless? On this topic of identity, there's issues of gender, masculinity, race. Um, One professor, Dr. Preventure, this is a good illustration here that I want to point out. Okay, he was talking about people learning French, and he said in order to speak French like a native speaker, there's certain things that you have to do with your head, with your lips, with your hands, and he pointed out in his research that for Anglo-Saxon men, these gestures, these motions, these expressions seem kind of feminine or kind of gay. So a lot of Anglo-Saxon American men might find it impossible, or like they might find their ideal French self a threat to their masculinity. All right, so that's just an example. Cultural conflict, I guess you could say, and gender conflict, right? Okay, so let's wrap it up. Um, while the individual learners must bear some responsibility for their successes and failures in the L2, it does not help to blame them for their lack of motivation. Their motivation is a result of their context, and it is not an inherent trait. They're not born motivated or unmotivated, and it's not fair to call them lazy or whatever. Teachers and the experiences they create play a major role in influencing learners' motivation. Oftentimes, we see people who are not successful in learning a second language, and we get angry at them. We consider them to be lazy or consider them a threat to our nation and culture. Not only is this not fair because these people are not solely responsible for their failure to learn the language, but it is counterproductive. The harsh judgment, mistreatment, isolation, stigma, and lack of empathy might create a situation that makes it even less likely that these people will want to learn the language. You cannot really force someone to learn something they don't want to learn. The best you can do is make them want to learn and provide them with opportunities and support. All right. Thank you very much.